Vauxhall and Opel. Now they're in an interesting position. A month ago, GM was in charge of them. Now, Peugeot and Citroen have bought them out for a cool £1.9 billion. Sort of. With GM leaving the European car market, kind of. Peugeot and Citroen Group, now we're going to call them PSA Group, are now the second biggest group, just behind the VW and Audi Group. First, let's talk about Vauxhall and Opel's history. Voxel was founded in 1857 by Alexander Wilson, a Scottish marine engineer, who called it Alex Wilson and Company. Then in 1863, it was bought by Andrew Betts Brown, who began building travelling cranes. Then in 1897, they changed the name to Vauxhall Ironworks. 6 years later, they built their first car with 6 brake horsepower, with its slow-revving single-cylinder and a chassis that was forward-thinking. Then in 1905, they started moving their majority of production to Luton. The company continued to trade under the name of Vauxhall Ironworks until 1907, when the modern name of Vauxhall Motors was adopted. 1908, they created the Vauxhall A-Type that grew out to the Y-Type that beat the Rolls-Royce on a 200-mile speed test at the newly built Brooklands track. 1910, Vauxhall created the Prince Harry with its distinctive pointed radiator that was the most popular Edwardian car ever, loved by many wealthy consumers at the time who regarded this as sporting as something of an adventure, coupled with new interests in tech. In 1925, Voxel was acquired by GM on November the 16th for $2.5 million, a deal encouraged by GM President Alfred P. Sloan Jr. The first car they built with GM is a short wheelbase 21 brake horsepower model. 5 years later, both their image and brand was changed by GM, and they started production on the low-cost 2-litre Cadet, retailing at £280, with the first British car to feature a synchromesh gearbox. A year later, they started production on the Bedford truck that was based on the Chevy truck. Then in 1940, in Luton, was halted for production of cars to make way for the Mark I to Mark III Churchill tanks, despite a bombing raid in 1940, killing 39 people. Voxel assembled 5,600 tanks in under a year at Luton and at many other sites, and produced 250,000 lorries for the war effort. 1942 marked their second factory at Dunsfold plant, which created for Bedford's designs for common British use. After the aftermath of World War II, the first proper Voxels were the 6-cylinder Velox and the 4-cylinder Wyvern that used the same chassis and alligator bonnet. A 2-year waiting list for the new cars reflected industry-wide obligation to export half of its export. 1962, Vauxhall creates their new factory at Ellesmere Port, Cheshire, initially making components to supply to the production line in Luton before car passenger production in 1964. The Vauxhall Viva debuted in 1963, and it was Vauxhall's answer to the Cortina. The Viva was the smallest car they have ever produced. With a 1057cc engine, it found huge success within the market because it was cheap, easy to produce, safe and reliable, so they kept this car going till 1979. But in 1963, the competition against Ford vs Vauxhall, Luton vs Dagenham, begun, in my opinion. Voxel debuted the Cavalier in 1975, and it was the most important and successful Voxel made. The Cavalier became Britain's best-selling car, beating the Ford Sierra. Around the same time, late 70s to mid-80s, GM started phasing the branding between Vauxhall and Opel, which meant Vauxhall stayed in the UK and Opel went everywhere else except the UK to sell their cars. In 1979, Vauxhall debuted the Astra, which is Vauxhall's first transverse-engined car with front-wheel drive. That's a first for Vauxhall. Despite having a quiet debut, it sold phenomenally well. 5 years later, they introduced the Vauxhall Astra GTE, and that is a classic. Wait, let's talk about Opel's history, because why not? They're gonna have similar history, Opel was established on the 21st of October 1862 by founder Adam Opel in Rüsselsheim, Germany. They started building sewing machines in a cowshed in Rüsselsheim. Above all, success lied on customizable sewing machines. Also, Opel introduced a health plan for their factory workers. Business was going well, so Opel expanded into the bicycle industry, which is their second venture. Fun fact, Adam Opel's sons were enthusiastic cyclists. They raced 700 races up until 1898. In less than 40 years, Opel became the biggest bicycle producer. Then in 1899, Opel stopped making bikes to make cars, with the first car called Opel Patent Motor System Lutzmann, and that's a mouthful. Also, they started production in Rüsselsheim. 2 years later, Henrik von Opel wins the Königsstuhl hill climb near Heidelberg in an Opel Lutzmann. 5 years later, they produced their 1000th car. In 1909, Opel introduced their affordable compact car for the 4 kilowatt 8 brake horsepower 2-seater built for customers who wanted reliability. In 1912, Opel celebrated their 15th anniversary. Then they produced the 10,000th car. Unfortunately, disaster struck Opel's factory in Rüsselsheim when the factory burnt down. In 1919, Opel integrated the racetrack with the factory in Rüsselsheim. The oval track contained bank curves in paved concrete. It was the first permanent track in Germany, with Berlin, Avus, and Nürburgring, aka the only track in the world to follow. In 1924, Opel was the first German manufacturer to introduce high-volume methods for the future, including assembly line processes. In 1929, GM acquired 80% of the shares in the Adam Opel Company for $26 million, becoming 80% of the owner of the company. Then 2 years later, they bought the remaining shares. 1935, Opel unveiled the Olympia, Germany's first mass-produced car, with an all-new body frame, 1.2-litre engine, better safety, and improved aerodynamics. It went great for 5 years, right up until World War II, when the German government demanded everyone, all the industrial companies, to make weapons or vehicles. If they didn't, their companies would be seized by the German government. So Opel made military trucks with the Blitz brand. Then in 1944, half of the Opel factory in Rüsselsheim got bombed by the Allies. Also, their other factory in Brandenburg nearly got destroyed. Thanks to the Opel Capitan selling like Pop-Tarts, Opel upgraded their factory in Rüsselsheim. In 1951, they were the first to establish an on-site proving grounds. In 1957, Opel debuted the Rexford P1 at the Frankfurt Motor Show. This car lasted for 3 years, selling 850,000 cars. This car looks eerily similar to the Vauxhall PA Cresta Mark II, which looks hands down slick. In 1962, Opel rebooted the Kadett after the Soviets took the resources out of the Kadett factory. If it wasn't for Oliver in the Top Gear Botswana special, I would think this car is neither bad or good. At least Richard Hammond. Can I mention one of my favourite cars of the 60s? The 1968 Opel GT, not the 2007 one. I like it due to its story, looks and rotating lights. Also, its advertising slogan was, quote, "Only flying is better." Around 1970, Opel released the Manta, and it looks as good as a GT in every other way. The car is clearly more masculine than the GT, but the GT has more curves than the Manta. Then, the Monza Coupe had to replace the GT, and it did look cool in the 70s for the sports cars around then, but now it looks clearly outdated. It looks like a Coupe Cavalier, which is funny. But it failed due to the Datsun 240Z being better in every way. Then in 1972, Opel had the biggest foot in the market with 20%, which makes it the biggest German manufacturer at the time. In 1981, Opel did a study called Tech 1, an aerodynamic test, which demonstrates Opel's pioneering role in the field of aerodynamic. The test vehicle achieved a coefficient drag of 0.235 CD, better than Nissan GT-R R35 with 0.27 CD. In 1986, Bedford started being phased out with its heavy truck business. In 1987, that got divested into GM, which meant somehow it started out as AWD Limited, then next it got sold to Caterpillar. And with the light commercial vehicles, that somehow stayed around for 4 more years until they just scrapped the idea and just named it Voxel or Opel Vans, depending where you live and where you are. In 1986, Voxel gave the Carlton a new generation, which got the Car of the Year that year. This was your average fleet car until Lotus went perfecting the Carlton and making it the fastest saloon with a top speed of 176 miles an hour, 377 brake horsepower, Lotus tuned suspension with a price tag of £48,000 for perfection. Now with the Vauxhall Calibre having a coefficient drag of 0.26 CD, showing you can be aerodynamic whilst being beautiful. The Calibre gained notoriety in the sports car market despite being a Voxel. The Calibre lasted for 6 years with 4 seats and a V6 engine, which the Vectra had to pick up where it started. The Vauxhall Corsa was introduced in 1993, which many people had this as their first car, and racers racing this car. The car features power steering, anti-lock brakes, and a car alarm. Funnily enough, they used water-based paints and a CFC aircon with a pledge of 90%, whatever that means. In 1995, the Vectra took the torch from the Caliber, but it was a bit off with the boring exterior. At least it had quote from Voxel, superb build quality with being one of the best cars in its segment. At least it's not as boring as the second and third. A year before the millennium, Voxel introduces a Ferrarinator which kicked off the decline of Voxel. Why this car? First, let's look at the exterior, and it looks terrible. Secondly, the interior looks like it went into a time warp in the 80s. I wish this car had more effort put into it, and with a higher budget and more time put into it. In 2000, Voxel introduced VX Racing that was in charge of the BTCC team and let Voxel join the sports car market again with the VX220, which was based on the Lotus Elise. It was Voxel's last proper British sports car until we had the Monaro, which was Australian, but we can't count that. 1 year later, they introduced VXR, that was basically VX Racing, but with an R. Ever since 2000, Vauxhall/Opels have been kind of a joke, except the Holden V8s, and I'll tell you why. One, in the UK, like me, we have been consumers for a long time, and I'm not saying we haven't built much cars, far from that. Many people prefer BMWs, Mercedes, and Lexuses. The point is, Vauxhall have tend to be lacking in everything since 2000. Luxury, prestige, and better deals. And it's the same with the Australians, with Holden. Second, identity. What do you think of the modern Vauxhall/Opel? I guess they're confident, not exciting. In my opinion, BMW combines luxury with driving pleasure. Once Voxel was able to do that whilst being sensible, but in my opinion, they're not doing it now. So I think they should either collaborate with Lotus or just release the Opel Gt as a cool halo car. Thirdly, PCP/company cars. What is PCP? It's kind of similar to company cars. For example, if you buy a Vauxhall Corsa, it will be £10,000. But if you buy it on PCP, you're gonna eventually buy bit by bit until you either buy the car outright or you just get another PCP car. It's kind of similar to company cars in a way. But when PCP went mainstream, companies like Volkswagen and Volvo thrived, whilst Vauxhall and Opel took the killing blow. Now there's some good news, depending who you are. Brexit might be coming to make PCP cars expensive, and soon there'll be more people buying cars outright, new or used. Fourthly, styling. Starting from the mid-90s to present day, the styling blows, from the Vectra lacking identity, from the VXRs lacking punch. I think they should hire fresh designers off the web to combine retro with modern across the range, not like the Vauxhall Adam and Viva. Finally, advertising. Other than Opel's "the future is everyone," the advertising's a bit meh, with Pajama Mums, where they just wear pajamas and ride around in SUVs, which is so unsubtle. It's like, imagine getting hit by a baseball bat. That is painful. No advertising, I can't really say anything about it. What's the solution? Terminate their mums in pajamas adverts for being distasteful. Raise the quality of your adverts to 110%. Also bring back the style of the Vauxhall Cavalier Mark III Sledgehammer advert, but just make it more modern, or just bring something new to the table. Let's get back on track with the history with GM. GM apparently bought 7% of Peugeot for €320 million in 2012. The 1st of August 2017, Peugeot has basically bought 93% of Vauxhall and Opel. Let me tell you why. From 2012 they basically bought 7% of Peugeot, but never mind. I might as well just mention it. What will happen in the future for Vauxhall and Opel? I think if it goes well, GM will basically buy as many shares in Peugeot as possible, and Citroen. Also, I think they may differentiate themselves in the next couple decades. I doubt that will happen, and if I'm really lucky, they might release a family of Halo cars. I've heard Toyota are doing it. More realistically, both Vauxhall and Opel are taking baby steps to become better, and let's exclude the Viva, the new one. Except, just please make your video on Vauxhall and Opel's history. Tell them what they should do better and tell them what not to do. Or just send this video to them, if possible. I've got a message to Peugeot. Just please bring back the Insignia Lotus. Vauxhall and
or
Opel,
just the Opel GT.
they're in an interesting
That
position.
will be slick.
A month ago,
Also,
GM was in charge
don't
of
you
them.
ever bring
Now,
back the mums
Peugeot
in
and Citroen
pyjamas
have bought them
or
out
the
for
Voxel
a cool
Vectra,
1.9 billion.
That won't make
sort
Vauxhall
of,
and
with
Opel
GM
great
leaving the
again.
European market,
What
sort of.
did you think of this
The
video?
Peugeot group
Was it
with
inspiring?
Citroen,
Do
and
you
now the
hate
second
the
biggest
Vectra?
group,
Place
just
it in
behind the
comments
VW
below,
and Audi
and I'll
group.
see you next
First,
week.
let's look at
And
both
on
the
that
histories of
bombshell,
Voxel.